Short is our keynote today. He is a native of Raleigh, North Carolina with a master's degree in public administration from NC State. I'm sorry. Sarah, go Heels. He has spent the last 15 years helping transform good cities into great ones in many capacities as the former president and CEO of Downtown Grand Rapids Incorporated, and in positions both on the public and private sides of community leadership in Long Beach, California, and Grand Rapids, Michigan. Having experience in both urban design and economic development, Kris can easily translate market dynamics, architecture, and the public realm into redefining placemaking experiences. Kris has been the president and CEO of Downtown Raleigh Alliance since January of 2018 and has been instrumental in leading DRA to realize the organization's mission and to manage and develop downtown Raleigh. Welcome, Kris.
Thank you very much. So before I get started, I do want to say thank you for this opportunity to speak to this group. It's not often where you get requested to come speak at the Golden Globes, and unfortunately I turned that down because it just wasn't that big. And then they said, no, Golden Modes, and I'm all in, because these are my people. But really also to give a speech where I'm literally sort of preaching to the choir, that is also one of those rare opportunities where you kind of have a sense that everybody's going to agree with you. And today we're going to talk about freedom. Not transportation, we're going to talk about freedom. Right? Because we were born to move. First crawling, then walking, and before long, running. I should say that this slide originally had both Terry and Paul in their Lycra outfits, getting ready for a long ride, but I decided I'd go with the cute kids instead. But we then moved on, right? And we began adding wheels and expanding our range of mobility and learning to explore, and eventually to race. Or perhaps carpool in the great commute of life. And head out on the road together. Right? This all sounds great. Right? The American dream, as it were. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, that dream became a bit of a nightmare. And that urge to move, that deep urge to move, just to move forward a little bit, to feel some progress, and not be stuck behind those taillights anymore, that turned into this dreadfully slow commute that helps to inspire a lot of your individual work today. And I'm sure that many of you have other ways to describe that. But that's, of course, why we as employers, right, those of us who have an opportunity to lead teams, we really want to make sure that they are provided the best. And that is why, of course, we require that all of our employees shop at Whole Foods. Right? Because for our employees, we want them to spend the most possible on fresh produce. And similar to that, Nordstrom. We want our employees looking the best, which is why, as a part of our employment arrangements, we require that they buy all their suits and ties, their beautiful blouses at Nordstrom. All right, you guys know what I'm talking about. Now, of course, we don't do either of those two things, but many of us still do this. Right? By only offering employer-paid parking, we are essentially telling our employees that they have to drive. And we incentivize, if not mandate, the most expensive form of transportation. And this is way more financially harmful than requiring that they shop exclusively at Whole Foods or Nordstrom, and I'll show you why. Because that cost is borne not just by that employee. It builds up to create societal trade-offs, staggering governmental liabilities, and environmental disaster. We're all ready to step off the ledge now? Well, let's think about this. Right? What can we do as managers of people? How can we focus our micromanaging of their lives to focus instead on those TPS reports rather than coercing decisions that affect their physical, mental, and financial health? And ultimately, we have to look at the composition of our workforce and recognize that they are not all like us, right? We have the privilege of leading diverse groups of men and women, right? And diverse in many ways, including age, preferences, gender, race, sexuality. It runs the gamut. And that includes the way that we want to get to work. And this composition is going to continue to change. But ideologically, it's going to become more homogeneous, particularly as a particular generational cycle cycles out. So what does that mean for savvy employers looking to recruit and retain a diverse workforce? It means we got to get back to our roots and offer more freedom to choose. Choose what works for them as individuals. Because you can buy a gallon of milk at any one of a dozen grocery stores and probably hundreds of convenience stores, other than Whole Foods. No offense to the Whole Foods folks if you're in the room. But it also means liberating them from these mind-numbing, dreary experiences of cycling parking decks, looking for that choice spot that is not on the roof. I think you all know what I'm talking about. And the brutal reminders of what can happen when our focus is on cars rather than on people, and what that means for our land use in our most precious urban centers. So I give to you parking cash out. Right? This hopefully isn't a new term for you, but it speaks to people at the point where it can truly influence behavioral change, because it speaks to them first at their wallet. Instead of giving them that parking pass, you give them the cash equivalent of that parking pass, and you say, I don't care how you get to work, just get to work. If you want to keep that money and put it in your pocket and take the bus or utilize a van pool or walk or ride your bike 20 miles each way, that is your choice. But it's not our job to worry about where you park. And it's been proven to work even in communities that have poor access to public transit, shifting on average 25% of employees away from parking as their first choice. Of course, it's a voluntary program. It comes at no cost to any one of your individual employees. Right? They're still provided that same financial cost. If they wanted to go back and lease a monthly parking space, that's their choice. Right? Or again, they can put that in their pocket to subsidize their Whole Foods purchases. Right? Or to buy that fancy tie at the Nordstrom. But it also, of course, has health benefits. It can reduce single occupancy commuting, congestion, make more efficient use of what we have as it relates to parking, and then ultimately relieve our governments from that burden of having to indebt themselves over a period of decades, particularly the coming decades, where we have no idea what type of innovation is going to be presented to change the way that we move. I'll offer a short case study with a downtown Raleigh employer. They have more than 100 employees in downtown Raleigh, this company Pendo, and they provide, instead of parking, a $100 stipend as an alternative, and only 45% of their employees take the parking, which means of their 120 employees, 66 are not encumbering parking spaces within our public parking supply. Now you start to think about that and you aggregate it at a larger scale. In downtown Raleigh, we have roughly 10,000 available monthly parking spaces. If all of our employers were to adopt this strategy, even with that average level of uptake at 25%, we would free up 2,500 parking spaces within our downtown parking supply, which ultimately can save the city of Raleigh upwards of $75 million in indebtedness to continue to expand the supply. And it's simple, and it costs nothing, and it provides that ultimately that freedom to choose for each one of our employees. And this freedom is absolutely critical, because getting back to those pocketbooks, and we talked about grocery and apparel. Right? If you see in the middle slide, or the middle chart, the average American family spends about 13% on food and 4% on apparel. Those two numbers added together, and I'm no math major, 17%. Lower than the transportation costs for the average American family at 19%. Right? So if we can relieve that level of automobile dependency, even just moving from a 2-car to a 1-car family, we can create that much more discretionary spending that can be applied to other parts of that pie, and ultimately help to increase the affordability of our growing communities. Plus, it encourages us to better care for our persons. You know, those bodies that we spend trillions on, 3.3 trillion on last year, annually in healthcare, and those bodies whom we depend on as employers to be productive members of our team. But of course, that begs the question about whether or not the environment that we're asking our employees to utilize to be able to get to work is going to be accommodating for them and their choices, which begins to beg the question for public servants and those of us that are in the process of designing our public realm, whom we are designing for. Are we simply designing for efficiency? Are we simply designing for what we know to be true, the tried and true over the last century? Or are we designing for the multitude of potential users who want to just get to work safely? And of course, when we think about safety, we have to ask ourselves, how many more people, citizens, family members, neighbors, co-workers, friends, trick-or-treaters, are we willing to sacrifice in the name of efficiency, particularly on our neighborhood streets, where we regularly see traffic moving at 30 and 40 miles an hour? You see the difference in the percentage probability of survival with a pedestrian and automobile collision at that speed, and what that means for the safety of those who do not choose to move through the use of a car. And this is also true in downtown Raleigh, where we have roads that allow people to move upwards of 45 and 50 miles an hour. And the divides that creates, and the level of insecurity that creates. Because ultimately, pedestrians aren't just like you and me, those of us who are sort of bought into this idea of alternative commuting, and I would argue that it's not alternative at all. It is literally just enabling us to choose that which we, the way that we prefer to move. But they are anyone and everyone. And many communities are stepping up and realizing that they may be late to adapting, but they are trying. They are building more accessible streets with better bicycle facilities and safer crossings and slower vehicular speeds. Places where all people are a priority, not just those measured by level of service calculations. Places that tell people that you are safe here. But even when we're trying to do the right thing, those dockless automobiles end up all over the damn place, and we just have to improvise. Those of you spending time in the city of Raleigh right now know what I'm talking about. But ultimately, this topic of mobility and the more diversity that we design for, that we choose to incentivize and enable as employers, the better it will work not only for all of our employees, but for all of those members of our community who call it home. And for those of you faced with critics like this guy, remind them that we don't justify bridges by counting the number of people swimming across a river. And with that, I'll leave you with this photo and ask, do these people need a bridge, a bike lane, or maybe just a better map?